Items you'll need for today's painting of the tulips. So we have a canvas. Any size canvas will do, or you can use cardboard or paper, whatever you have at home, poster board. Okay, we're using a couple different size paintbrushes. Really, you just need a bigger one and a smaller one. Paper towel to clean your brushes, water to clean the brushes, and some paint. So I'm using black and white. Those are some fairly important ones. The other ones are really optional. Purple, because purple is what the color I'm going to do my tulips. Yellow for the background and green for the leaves. Feel free to substitute any colors you like. All right, I'm Melissa from Paint Party LI. I'm going to be painting with you today the mason jar vase of tulips. So first we're going to get started by prepping the canvas, and we're going to use the large brush, whatever bigger brush size you have, some water, and I'm going to brush it on from the top to the bottom, getting all the drips, making sure it's not a ton of water on there, just a thin coat all the way down to the bottom of the canvas. This is just getting the canvas ready for the paint, so you won't have to keep dipping your brush so many times into the water while you're painting. All right, so we're going all the way down to the bottom. Again, you can do this flat on a table. You don't have to do it on an easel. If you have one, great. If you don't, that's fine too. Okay, if you're just doing cardboard or paper instead of a canvas, you can skip this step. All right, got a nice thin coat on there, just making sure I don't have any big drips coming down, otherwise my paint will drip down too. All right, so with that large brush, we're gonna paint the entire background. When I do this, I'm gonna mix a little bit of white and some yellow. You don't need to use a ton of paint. Okay, so we're gonna go vertical brush strokes. I like them a little bit streaky. You don't have to lay it on super thick. The canvas is nice and wet, so it's just going to brush on and streak through, showing a little bit of that white canvas through in the background, which I like. Okay, we're gonna do the entire background just like this. Adding a little bit more paint to your brush. And again, the canvas, if you're using canvas, it's pretty wet, so it should glide on pretty easily. If you're doing a solid background on a piece of paper, you can just do a nice solid thin coat of paint in the background. Again, whatever color you like. We're using yellow, but you can use whatever you like. Okay, so I'm going to keep doing the entire background until I have the whole thing a light yellow. Every once in a while, you may want to dip your brush into a little bit of water just to keep it going. If you feel like it's not spreading out and going on as thin as you would like. Okay, so we're doing the whole background here. Adding a little tiny bit of white to my brush and a little bit of yellow. And then just kind of streaking it across, going vertical brush strokes all the way across the back of the canvas. Till I have a good coat all the way across the background. When I'm done with this, I'm going to blow dry it a little bit so I can move on to the next step, but you can either blow dry or you can let it dry, air dry a few minutes. Shouldn't take very long depending on how thick you put your paint on. Okay, so we're just getting a nice thin coat of that yellow and white all the way across. And again, every once in a while, just kind of dipping a little bit of water in there just to spread it out nicely. You want that paint nice and thin so that when you paint on top of it, it'll glide on there nicely and the background will dry a little quicker. Okay, so we're doing a nice thin coat all the way across. Make sure you have some color across the entire thing. Again, it's a little streaky. I kind of like it like that. I'm purposely not doing a thick, solid coat. All right, so once you have that entire background done, you're gonna put your brush in the water, clean it out really well, tap it down to the bottom of the cup. getting all the paint out. If you just swirl it around in there, it's not going to get all of the paint out. So you want to tap it down, get all the paint out, and then dry it on a paper towel. I'm going to blow dry real quick. Okay, once the canvas is dry, we can get started on putting in all the stems and leaves for the tulips. We're going to put those in first. I'm going to use a smaller brush. Doesn't matter exactly what size you have, just something smaller than the background one. All right, so I'm going to use a little bit of green paint and dip the brush into a little bit of green paint, and I'm going to start to mark them off. When I do, keep in mind that you want the bottom of them to be inside the mason jar. We're going to put the mason jar over it once it's dry and painted on there, but I want to have them into one spot. So if you're doing your mason jar in the middle, just keep your stems down in the middle. Don't spread them all out, so that once you put your mason jar, it doesn't matter where you place it, just want to have them all somewhere together so that when you put the mason jar in there, they'll look like they're inside the jar. All right, so I've got some green paint on here, and I'm going to glide a few. I'm going to do, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stems, and then I'll start putting the leaves in. So they don't have to go anywhere specific. I'm just dragging it across. I'm not pressing down very hard. You want to drag it gently so that it gives you a skinny line. You can always go back in there and thicken it up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to do a second one right here. Again, these are just kind of placement lines. I'm going to go back in there and paint them in a little thicker. Try to decide where your mason jar is going to be height-wise so that you know where to put the tulip heads up there. Okay, so I'm going to keep one at least high up. Okay. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 so far. Let's see, maybe I'll put another one over here. And then I'm going to have one hanging over the jar. And your stems can definitely overlap each other, that's fine. Okay, so I'm just getting them all inside there, and then I'm going to start putting in the tulips next. Then I'll thicken up the stems and get into the leaves. I want to make sure I have room for my tulips, and I'll paint around them with the leaves because the tulip heads are much more important than the leaves will be. Those are just fillers. All right, so I'm cleaning off my brush, tapping it down to the bottom of the cup, getting all the paint out. I'm going to go into some purple paint. Now, depending on what color purple you have, a lot of them are really translucent, so you want to add a tiny touch of white to that purple. Just the tiniest bit will help it thicken it, get it a little bit more opaque. Most purples are like this. If you've already got a purple that's in a lighter shade, you might not need to do that. But I've got some purple in my brush. I'm using the smaller one still. You don't have to use a super tiny one, just something a little smaller than the one we painted the background with. All right, so I've got some purple paint on there. Now I'm going to start to do ovals. Okay, I'm placing them in there, getting where I'm going to put them. Again, I have just a little bit of white paint mixed in there. I am going to add highlights and things to these once I get them painted in there, but right now I'm just getting the shape. And you'll see even once I start painting, this purple is a slightly different shade than what I've got over here. Some purples have a little more red in it, some have more blue. Okay, so I'm just doing these kind of oval shapes. I do have somewhat of an open top on my oval. You can overlap them definitely. And it doesn't matter the exact placement of them, you just want to get them in there to just kind of get a placeholder for them. Okay, and then finally I have this one kind of pointed down. Okay, so once you get your main oval shapes in there, we'll start filling them in. And I'm just going to do like a medium purple in there so that when I'm ready to get the highlights in there and some of the shadowing, you'll be able to see it. Okay, so these will definitely take more than one coat, and I'm just brushing them down. The top part is going to be these brush strokes that are just kind of very loose, and the bottom will come to more of a smooth closure on the bottom. These tulips are super easy to do. There's no real specific shape to them other than oval. You don't have to worry about getting them to look exactly like what I've got here. Kind of an open brush stroke where I'm just brushing down, and then I'm making it rounded like an oval at the bottom. Again, those will get another coat. I'm gonna let those dry while I move on to doing some of the leaves and thickening everything up. All right, so I'm cleaning off that smaller brush. I'm gonna use that for most of this. Okay, going into some more green. Now, you'll notice the greens here have darks and lights. I added a little bit of black to it. At some point, if you add black, you want to use very, very little of that because it'll take over really quickly. All right, so when we do the leaves, now again, you want to imagine a jar here. Okay, so I'm going to do a leaf maybe up here. When I do this, I'm just going to give it a pointy end and a nice thick part in the middle. You don't have to worry about carrying that line all the way down. They'll start to blend in and look like they're coming from the stems. Okay, and again, this is just the placement. So I'm just gonna do a few of these. I'm not gonna do a ton. I'll do another one here. And you'll see I'm just dragging the brush very lightly. You don't wanna press down. You wanna hold closer to the bristles. Gives you better control. Hold it almost like a pencil. Right. And that one's gonna look like it's behind that tulip. So I just kind of gave it a point, dragged it down. I'm just leaving them open right now. I'm gonna go back and fill them in just a moment. And I'll maybe do another one right here. You can always go back in and add as many as you want of these. Okay, the key is get a good point on the end of your leaf and just drag it down gently. I'm gonna go back and fill all of them in now. Again, that's just with my green. I have kind of an oxide green, which is a little bit more almost like an olive type of green. It's not a bright Kelly green. You can use whatever color you want, whatever you have at home. Mix some if you don't have it, a little yellow, a little blue. If you want it more of a realistic kind of leaf color, add a little tiny bit of black or a little bit of brown in there. Okay, and now I'm just going to go back in. I'll just put a little leaf right here too. It looks a little empty. I'm going to go back in and thicken up some of those stems now. Okay, so once you get your leaves filled in, and you might need to pause this so that I don't move ahead of where you're at. Go back in with your brush. I'm just going to thicken up those little, make sure they're nice and solid, those stems. Again, if you add a tiny bit of white to your paint, that'll help you get a nice solid look to it. Just a little tiny bit. Makes it a little bit more opaque. Okay, and I'm just going to do all of those tulips. A nice, easy, light coat. When I do it, I'm not pressing down very hard. I'm just kind of dragging it along. I just don't want it to look feathery. So if you are painting on a canvas and it has texture as you go, you want to make sure you have enough paint on there that it's filling in all of the texture of that canvas. So you want to have enough paint on your brush or a little bit of water so that when you glide it down, it fills in and it doesn't look all light and feathery as you go. Okay, and I'm going to do that for all of them, just thickening up those stems a tiny bit. You'll definitely need to go back in and do another coat on those leaves. Again, you're going to let that dry. Okay, while I'm doing that, finishing all that stuff, letting it dry, I'm going to clean off my brush. I'm going to switch to a slightly bigger brush now, or you can go back to that background brush. I have kind of an in-between one, but you can certainly use the big one if you want to, or whatever size you have. Make sure you wet it a little bit, dry it off. Just want to dampen the bristles a little bit. I'm going to go back into this purple now. You see it's pretty see-through. I want to add another coat to it, and I want to start to fill it in so it gets thick, so I can start adding some white and then some black to it to really kind of give it depth and make it feel like it's a little bit more round rather than just a flat piece on there. Okay, so you're going to start back with your tulips, a little bit more purple paint. I have a little tiny bit of white in there. Again, depending on what color purple you're working with, you might not need white in there. I'm going to go back in and just kind of very gently drag a second coat across, getting them a little bit more solid and just filling them all in. Okay, so if they were looking really see-through before, this will start to really thicken it up a little bit. Again, I have a tiny bit of white in my purple. You may not need that with yours depending on what purple you use, but I always find the purple to be a little bit translucent. So remember, these tulip shapes are really kind of just an egg shape, and on top it just has a jaggedy edge. The bottom part being a nice smooth bottom of an oval shape or an egg shape. Okay, getting that purple in there. And just filling it all in. If you are painting on there and it seems like you just can see through it over and over again, blow dry it or wait for it to dry a little bit, and that second coat will go on really nicely. So I'm gonna let that dry. I'm gonna clean off my brush really well, tapping it down to the bottom of the cup, getting all the paint out, and then drying it off on the paper towel. It's okay if the water that comes off of there is stained. You don't need to get new water. Just wanna make sure that your paint is off the brush. All right, so now that I have that, I'm gonna start to mark off the jar, the mason jar. I am gonna go back to the leaves, I'm gonna go back to the tulips, add a little bit more depth, a little more shadow to all of those things, but I just wanna mark off that mason jar. I'm gonna use a smaller brush. This one's pretty small, but you could definitely use something bigger. You don't have to have a super tiny one, just something small. The idea is that when you do this, you want to be able to do a nice thin line, and you don't want to apply a lot of pressure because you don't want to make a really thick line as you go. This, I'm just marking it off. If your stems still look wet, blow dry them or let them dry before you do this step. You want this to be nice and dry. All right, so I'm going to mix a little white, a little bit of black. Just taking the tiniest bit of black because that black really takes over quickly. Okay, so I've got a little gray on there. And I'm going to start to mark off my jar. When I do that, I'm going to mark off the top lines, and then the outside, and that back one that kind of peeks through, which is the top lip of the jar. All right, so I'm going to go a little curve right here, and my jar hangs off the edge. If yours is a little bit more in the middle, you'll make both sides of the jar. Okay, so a great way to do this is hold the brush real close to the bristles, almost like a pencil. I also like to put my pinky out and rest it on the canvas. That anchors it. Gives you a little bit more control. Okay, so I'm just doing a little curve in the line, making that line on the canvas. And I'm going to do one for the second bottom part of that jar lid, or lip, I should say. Okay, just a little curve in it. Connecting it, and now I'm going to give this jar a little shape on the side and bring it down. I just need a little bit more water in my brush so that it glides. Okay, I'm not doing the other side because my jar hangs off the edge of my canvas. If yours does not, then you just want to do the other side as well. Okay, so now I'm going to add a back lip to it. So this one goes around this way. The back part of the lip behind all the stems is going to curve the opposite direction here. It's going to curve up and over. So when you do this, you want to go in between your stems, so you're not painting across them. If you end up painting accidentally across them, just take a green paint and paint across it again. Okay, so it should look like they're inside the jar after you do that second part of the lip on top there. All right, so we're going to now add some white, like a whitewash to it, which is going to make it look like glass. And then we'll do some of our little lines in here to make it look like it's got the little threading on the top of that mason jar. Okay, so I'm putting that brush in the water. I'm going back to a big brush, getting a little water on it, and just some white paint. So when I do it, I'm going to grab some white with my brush that has some water in it. Just kind of rub it on the edge here and water it down a little so that I don't have a thick amount of white paint. I want a nice watery white, just a little bit on there, okay? And I'm gonna brush it across the lip here. Again, if your green is wet, let it dry. Otherwise, you're just gonna drag it all in there and smear it. So I'm gonna go up in the lip of this a little bit too. I'm gonna dry off my brush a little just to make sure I didn't pull any green in there. Nope, nice and clean. Grabbing a little tiny bit more water. Again, you can still use this water without cleaning it. It's going to give you enough clear water on your brush to do a whitewash, but if you feel like your water is super mucky, then you want to go ahead and get some clean water for this. So I'm just watering down some white paint, and now I'm going to start to brush down gently, just pulling it across. This is not a solid coat of paint. This is a very watered down white. I'm going to go all the way across my jar. This will give the appearance that it's got some glass that you're looking through, clear glass, okay? Just did a whitewash all the way across there. I'm going to take a little bit more white paint on my brush, just solid white, and just give it a brush stroke right down the side here. That'll give it kind of a reflection. All right, so I just added a little bit of whitewash all the way across, putting that big brush in the water. I'm going to go back to my little brush for a moment, and I'm going to add some little threading up in the lip of this jar. Okay, again, that's just a mixture of the white and black together. And I'm just going to do them here and there, a few little lines that go across so it looks like it's threading on that jar. Okay, if your lines are really stark on the edge of your jar, take a little bit of white paint. You can go right up over the edge of those, kind of soften them a little bit so that they're not so dark. Okay, you can even take a little bit more of that gray paint and give yourself a little bit of a shadow at the edge of the jar, so it kind of looks a little bit more rounded at the edges. Okay, then you're going to clean that brush off, leave it in the water. I'm going to go back in for another coat on some of my leaves, and this is when I'm going to start adding a little bit more of the black and the white to the green so that I can really kind of give it a little bit more depth and it's not just one solid painted color. Okay, so I'm going back into green. This time I'm going to add the tiniest bit of black. I just grabbed the tiniest bit with my brush and mixed it into some green, okay? You don't want to grab a ton because what that's going to do is really take over and you'll just have black leaves. Okay, so I added just a little bit this way. When I brush a few brush strokes in, it's going to give it a little bit more dimension, a little bit more feeling like it's a real leaf rather than just a flat color. Okay, now I'm not doing a complete coat of this. I'm just kind of brushing it in a little bit here and there. Potentially you could do a whole coat of it if you feel like your leaves are really kind of see-through. I'm going to go back in with a lighter green and brush a little bit more into that also. In the meantime, my tulips are drying. I'll be going back in when they're a little bit more dry and adding some more dimension to those shortly. Okay, so I'm just adding a little bit of that black with the green into some of my leaves. You can even add some into the stems if you feel like they're kind of see-through a little bit. Add a little bit of color to them by just putting a little bit of that green with the black in there. Okay, just kind of adding a little bit into those. Now I'm going to clean my brush off and I'm going to go in with some green with a little bit of white in it. You can kind of play around with that color back and forth a bunch of times. Just adding a little bit back and forth into it. Okay, so this is green with a little bit of white. It's going to kind of give it a little bit of a highlight. I'm just filling in a little bit here and there. You don't have to do a complete coat of each one of these, just kind of adding it into the leaf that you already have there. All right, so I added a little bit of black to my green. And I added a little bit of white to the green, cleaned it off in between those. Just adding a little bit more to the leaves here and there. Just giving them a little bit more dimension. All right, so I'm going to clean off that brush. I'm going to go into these purple tulips and I'm going to start to add some highlights and some shadowing and stuff in there. All right. Okay, so this is the same concept we just did to the leaves, where we added a little bit of white and a little bit of black into the color and then mixed it in and painted it on. This way it kind of gives us like a shadowing and a highlight effect. So I'm going to do the part with the white first, and I'm going to use kind of a medium brush. Get a little water on there. You can use your smaller brush for this too, that's fine. All right, I'm going to take a little bit of white and some purple. This one's going to be pretty light. Okay, and I'm going to just pick a spot on each one of them and give it a little bit of a brush stroke. So if you're doing the middle, do the middle on all of them. If you're doing it towards the left, do it towards the left on all of them. I'm going to do it somewhere towards the middle left, and I'm just going to brush a little bit onto each one of these, giving it a little bit of a highlight. Don't overthink it, it's just a couple little brush strokes on each one. All right, you do want it to be, the flowers to be dry for this step though. So when you start this, if they still look a little bit wet and shiny, just give them a quick blow dry or give it a few more minutes to dry. All right, so I'm picking one spot on the tulip, brushing down with a little bit of purple and white. Okay, more white than purple in there. Cleaning off that brush. You can still use that brush, or you can go to an even smaller one if you want to. I'm going to start to fill in some more of the purple over here, making sure that it's not see-through at all. And I'm going to add a little bit of black with purple to the edges. Okay, so I've got a little purple right here. I'm just going to fill in, because I feel like some of these are a little bit see-through still. That purple can be tricky. Sometimes it's a little bit see-through, again, depending on what purple you're using. If at any time while you're painting you feel like it's kind of lifting or you're seeing through it more once you put another coat on it, let it dry totally or blow dry it, because really you'll just keep pulling it up off the painting and you'll be able to see the canvas through it, and you don't want that. All right, so I've got a nice solid coat of purple. I'm going to take some purple with a little bit of black. When I do this, taking the tiniest bit of black, mixing it with some purple, and I'm just going to go here and there on the edges on the opposite side of where I put that highlight. So it's like a blackish purple in there, giving it a little bit of shadow. If you feel like you've got a little too much black in that purple, just mix a little more purple and go right over it, or let it dry a little bit and go right over it. The great thing about the acrylic paint is that you can paint over it a million times. So I'm just adding a little bit. If you feel like you want to put a touch of it on the other side of that highlight, if your highlight's somewhere towards the middle, you can do that as well. All right, but those are our tulips. The very last step is to sign your name on the bottom. So I'm just going to take my tiny brush, put my initials down on the bottom. Thanks for painting along with me. Hope you enjoyed it.